describe burning and teaching people about native plants. Here he is to talk about how wildlife management with native plants go hand in hand. Thanks, Austin.
Thank you. All righty. Can everybody hear me okay? All the way in the back? Everybody good? Okay, good deal. Good deal. Just want to make sure I was positioned right. So thanks for having me today. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Austin Klais, and I have been in Louisiana now for just a couple of years. So really excited to make it to my first Native Plant Society meeting. And it is really impressive the amount of people that are in the room. That's really exciting, really impressive. So we'll jump right in. So I do work for Quail Forever, who is a national nonprofit. They are similar to many other nonprofit wildlife organizations that y'all are familiar with. And depending on, I guess, where you are, that your perception of who Quail Forever is might look a little bit different. Here in Louisiana, we've had 2 biologists and a regional representative. Most of the work that is happening in Louisiana, it's mostly through the biologists and those chapters that we have throughout the state. There's 4 chapters throughout the state. But this is our team of wildlife biologists, including Louisiana and Arkansas. We do a lot of different work. Mostly in Louisiana, at least, we focus in North Louisiana. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. There are other biologists throughout the state that would certainly be available to talk to anybody about programs in your areas and ways that you can manage habitat. But most of what we do is larger scale plantings or larger scale land management. So a lot of times we're looking at anywhere from 5 to 500 acres. That's a lot of the people that we work with that are looking for managing their property, whether it's for quail, for turkey, for other wildlife species. That's what they're looking at. So we do have a few different challenges and some different situations than some of the other management types that we'll look at. So Quail Forever, like I mentioned, they were established in 2005. The parent company, Pheasants Forever, back in the 80s. But as Pheasants Forever kept growing and getting out of the pheasants range, they got into the quail range, so it made more sense to focus on quail down here. We do have 187 chapters in 30 states with 17,000 members nationwide for Quail Forever. I believe it's more than that, including Pheasants Forever. We have been growing our wildlife biologist program significantly over the past few years. Most of our biologists operate just like I do, working with private landowners in their respective areas. And I think we're actually over 20 states now. We do have the chapter model, like I mentioned earlier, and one of the unique things about our chapters is that whatever funds are raised locally, the chapters get to decide how exactly that money is going to be spent. So that's a little bit different than some organizations. And how we implement that, how we focus on providing quail habitat and creating better native habitats is through really 4 main pillars. The same pillars that actually y'all use, just we may not name them quite the same way, but very similar practices, similar things that we're doing. So habitat improvements being the main one that I do, working with private landowners, getting habitat changed directly on the ground. We do work with public access on a nationwide scale. So in areas that we want to build wildlife areas, if we want to help whether it's state wildlife management areas, federal properties, if there's ways to improve access for any of those, we definitely strive for that because we do want to make sure that we're engaging everybody that is interested in wildlife and giving them the opportunities to interact with those wildlife. Education is another big core that may be done through outreach events. We do just various types of outreach there. And then conservation advocacy. So we do have employees that actually work with the folks up in DC, trying to get legislation passed or improved as much as possible to create better wildlife habitat. So all that being said, the question comes to, why is a wildlife biologist, a quail biologist in particular, talking about native plants? So I'm going to kind of take a big picture view real quick and talk about quail. Quail have some pretty specific needs and use pretty specific habitats to include native grasses, native wildflowers, and native shrubs. And generally speaking, you can find that type of habitat everywhere that's on that map, or at least you used to be able to. So quail can cover anywhere from, you've got tall grass prairie states over to the northeast coast, down to Florida. There's a lot of variation across that range, a lot of geographic variation, temperature, weather, precipitation, all those things vary a lot. But what doesn't change and what has allowed quail to persist across that range is the presence of a matrix of native grasses, native wildflowers, and native shrubs. Now that looks a little bit different in each of those states and in each of those ecoregions, but it's important to know that that's what really ties it together. That habitat structure is what ties the quail range together. Because when you start looking at, okay, well, what all has impacted that? Not only the weather, the temperature, everything else, but what actually drives being able to maintain those ecosystems that have that good matrix for quail. So you start looking at that, and one thing in particular really stands out: the frequent occurrence of prescribed fire across that range. It almost matches up perfectly with the range of bobwhite quail. You go from the tall grass prairie states over to Florida, up to the Atlantic. So bringing that all back down to a state level, many of you are probably familiar with the different ecoregions that we had in Louisiana. That map just a minute ago showed fire being almost ubiquitous across the state. Of course, we know that would have had some variation depending on exactly where you're at. That was a little bit of a generalization. But fire frequency was 2 to 4 years, give or take, across most of the state. You do have, of course, you've got the Red River coming down, and then you've also got the Mississippi River over there. But anywhere that was not those two drainages, you certainly would have had natural fires occurring, whether it's down the prairies, in the pine hills, Florida parishes. All those landscapes and those plant communities are, generally speaking, very conducive to fire. So all that being said, we know that Louisiana has the potential for quail and historically did have quail, but what happened to them? We started doing quail surveys back around the 1960s and 70s and have been documenting quail declines ever since. Again, going back to that sad story that Jeff kind of started out with too. When you start looking at the pictures, it's rough. It really is. And so what exactly happened? We think about all the different species that are declining, and what are all the factors that go into it? There's a lot of factors, really. There's multiple factors that affect the vast majority of these species. Things like single weather events. So if you have a rough winter, if you have a dry summer, predation, any sort of natural predators or even non-native predators do have impacts on quail populations, absolutely. Everything loves to eat a quail, including most of us. So it's kind of hard to survive when everything likes to eat you. Urbanization, absolutely. Anywhere, somebody talked about living in concrete earlier. That is a huge challenge for most of our native wildlife. Parasites, just like most other species, there are parasites that impact those. Diseases. Fire ants is a big one that everybody asked me about, that we used to have quail up until fire ants showed up. And there's definitely some overlap in that timing, so it makes sense. It's a very good thought, and fire ants do have impacts on not only quail, but the insects they eat, the plants that they might use. Chemical usage, so in areas that are predominantly row crop, for example, or lawn landscapes where we're using a lot of chemicals to eliminate the native plants that would have occurred there. Now you've taken away that cover, you've taken away the plants that are producing the food, the seeds, the insects for quail. So you've taken away everything they need. That it makes sense that they wouldn't stand there through chemical usage. But all of that really ties back to habitat loss in some form or fashion. If you have the right types of habitat there, the correct matrix of native grasses, native wildflowers, native shrubs, you've got that structure, we can almost always find quail there if it's in a good landscape context. You can look at the map, and that is actually where the quail numbers have been decreasing across most of the range in the red. And then you've got a little area over here that's blue where quail numbers have been increasing in recent years. An interesting thing about that particular area, there's a lot of native rangelands out there. And for those of you that aren't familiar with native rangelands, that means native prairie. True, intact, unplowed, native prairie, most of that being managed with cattle for grazing, a lot of prescribed fire that occurs out there. And they also don't get near as much rainfall as we get. So it's a whole lot easier to maintain native grasses and wildflowers out there when you don't get 60, 80, 100 inches of rain a year. They don't get trees near as quickly as we do. So they do have a problem with some trees, but definitely not, just a little bit different challenges. So all of that being said, you know, what were some of those habitat changes in Louisiana? If we're saying that's the biggest cause, what are those? So we'll look at three main kind of land uses that we work in. The first one being forest lands. So again, we work with private landowners all across the state. People are trying to make the best thing out of their land that they can. And a lot of what has happened, at least in the hill country over the past few decades, are pine plantations. And trying to make money off the property isn't inherently bad, but there are ways that we can be more beneficial for wildlife, because when you have something like this, there's no cover. There's nothing on the ground other than pine needles, and there's almost nothing that uses that type of habitat. Same thing for our pastures. We've gotten a whole lot better at keeping clean pastures, clean hay fields. If there's any weeds out there, we spray them out, we cut it down 3 times a year for hay, put enough cattle on it, again, to try to make some money off the land, and that's not inherently bad by any means. But by considering what we're leaving there again, there's just nothing there for quail or for turkey. Same thing for row crop. You have bare soil situations, you've got literally no cover at all, and again, no native plant diversity. So quail, going through those three scenarios, you know, a lot of people have historically said that, well, quail are generalist, or they're kind of edge species. And that's kind of sort of true, but not really. It's only if the edge is the only place that we've left them. So in this example, you see you've got row crop here on the left, or some sort of disturbed soil with no cover, going to closed canopy forest on the right side. In that situation, yes, quail are edge species, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with maintaining areas in that type of habitat. As many of y'all know, and we've talked about several times already today, there was a lot of native prairie in Louisiana. That would have been perfect habitat for quail, and then other areas that would have been, for example, historically longleaf, shortleaf, other open canopy forest systems would have supported quail naturally. So all that being said, we get into how do we know the issues, we know where we're at right now, and still people pick up the phone calling us because they want quail, or they want to improve their turkey populations. So knowing those issues, we're faced with the options of what do we do with that? How do we improve these areas to get quail, to get turkey? Is that even possible? And then we have to figure out exactly how we're going to get there. We know where we're at, we know what they want, how are we going to get there? So we take a lot of time and try to dive into the history of the property, try to figure out what the historical uses were on that property. If it was cropland for 100 years before being planted in pine plantation, that gives you a very different situation than something that has been forested for the past 200 years that hasn't had that same level of disturbance. Looking at the soils data, somebody mentioned soils earlier. That's really important because you need to know what sort of species can even be supported by those soils in that habitat. Something that's relatively new, it's been put out by the USDA, are ecological site descriptions. And that's where the USDA matches up a known ecological site to the soils that occur on that property. So for example, you may have a group of 10 soils that would have naturally supported shortleaf pine, post oak forest. And then you had another group of soils that would have naturally supported shortleaf pine, southern red oak. Then another group that would have been bottomland hardwoods. So trying to figure out what natural systems were supported on those properties is really important. That way, we're not trying to just fight an uphill battle, trying to get quail in an area that should not and does not support native upland wildlife habitat. If it's not a good fit for it, then we need to look at, okay, well, what is the best use for that property? How can we improve it for the wildlife that should be using that property? Indicator plants. That's one that this group is probably particularly familiar with. When you go out to a property and you see certain plants that are indicators of being a highly disturbed system. So a lot of those, the aggressive plants that we think about, if they're aggressive in a garden setting, typically they're also aggressive in a natural setting. Their seeds may be wind dispersed, they're usually light seeded, they come in very quickly, very aggressively, which does not make them a bad species at all, but it's something that tells us the property has a little bit more intense management history, might have had years of intense soil disturbance, chemical usage, and has depleted the seed bank. Whereas if we go on a property that had some higher quality plants, higher conservation plants, then we know that we probably need to be a little bit more delicate with that site because we don't want to just go in and destroy everything in the name of quail, turkey, whatever it is, whatever the objectives are, we need to be cognizant of that. But it all does go back to landowner objectives. Since we work with private landowners, whatever they do with their land is completely up to them. And that's something we always have to be aware of. We don't ever want to step over that fact. But we do want to try to work with what those objectives are. And you can find ways to do that, whether you're talking about wildlife objectives, forestry, grazing, row crop situations. There's always places for native plants to fit into all of those systems. The question is just how do you do that? So as we go through the rest of the talk, we're going to review and go on a little story, I guess, with a landowner that actually came to us and wanted to do exactly this. He had non-native pasture, and he wanted it to be just the best wildlife habitat that it could be. And we're going to call him the Chicken Man. So the Chicken Man had been on a trip to Kansas. He loves turkey hunting, absolutely loves it. And he came back and was just talking about how great it was being out there. They had this prairie up on the hills, and it faded down into a woodland down near the streams, and there were turkeys everywhere. And he thought how great that was and how pretty it was to just be able to walk through the hills of the prairies and be able to see all that native cover and to get to hunt turkeys out there. So his objective was turkeys. That's what he wants. He wants to improve it for wildlife, for hunting, got a couple kids, wants to get them outdoors. And he bought this property, brand new to him. It was a former cattle pasture, had been cattle pasture for probably 50 years or more. So talked about how we actually assess the property. One of the first things we look at is a soils map. What you're looking at there, the red color is basically it's a bottom draw that goes through the property. You can see how it gets a little bit flatter in the center, right through there. Pretty flat with a few upland drains that go through there. And then everything in the blue is hills. So just think about that. You're looking at a property that's hills on both sides, caving into the middle. So we start talking about the prairie. And he spent all that time out there on the Kansas prairie and thought how great that was. So we're starting with a non-native condition. We had fescue, Bermuda, Bahia, all the non-native species that you can think of, they're in this pasture. And it's been that way for several decades, being cattle pasture. So comparing that to the native prairie that he was in, the prairie has a lot of diversity. It had plants growing the entire growing season, different flowers, shapes, structures, all those things which provide different facets of wildlife habitat and allows different species to thrive there. And it had a lot of plant diversity, a lot of those plants that we were looking at earlier that Jeff was putting up there. When you talk about native prairies, you talk about good, rich upland landscapes, you've got that diversity. You have more than just a few non-native grasses. And that's one of the things that he was really missing in those habitats. So we have taken the time to look at those ecoregions to develop local seed mixes for each of those ecoregions. And we talked to him about that he could actually take what is non-native grasses and convert it to native prairie type systems. Now, of course, that takes several years to get there. It's a long process. But we do custom make those mixes so that we make sure that any species that are being planted in those parishes are local, or they're native to that local area. Use resources like BONAP, Biota of North America project. For those of you that aren't familiar with that, that's a great resource. It does have a few flaws of its own, just be aware. It's not the end-all be-all resource, but it is a good one. So what's that process for actually getting from a non-native hayfield to a native planting? So the biggest thing is site prep. Number one issue that we see on large-scale plantings is trying to get the seed bank to a point where you can effectively plant something and have it grow. A lot of times what people want to do is want to avoid that intensive site prep, and the weeds just come back, whether it's non-native grasses or even some of those aggressive native species that we want, but only in certain moderation. So if your goal is to reduce the competing vegetation, then the best way to do that, on a large scale at least, is to use herbicides. We do try to be selective with what herbicides that we're using, match that to the property, make sure that the herbicides being used are effective on the property, they are effective on the vegetation that we're trying to kill. But really, especially when you're in a situation like this that has been a non-native landscape for decades, there's a pretty significant seed bank to work through, and that takes a lot of time. And herbicides have just been our most effective means for that. Another thing is that after using those herbicides, we try to avoid any soil disturbance, which would then be starting that seed bank back up. So no disking, no dredging, no anything like that. You're just trying to kill out the vegetation that's on top, kill out what's on the seed bank on top, and then move forward with planting your new species, your desired species. Best time to plant most of these species is December and January. So looking at dormant season plantings, you do have in these seed mixes, you've got usually 40 plus different species. So some of those do better sometimes of the year than others, but the vast majority of them, as y'all know, do better when they get that cold, moist stratification, which is important to break down the seed coats. So after you get that planted, it grows for a year. A lot of times almost always that first year, no matter how good of a site prep you've done, you will always get a flush of something. Hopefully, it's those native annuals. That's what you're shooting for, whether it's the ones that you planted or the ones in the seed bank. Those are really important to bring stability back to the system, to stabilize the soil, to get ready and prepare it for the perennials that are going to be coming the next few years. So after you get that first flush, plan on burning it the first year, and what you're going to be doing is releasing all the perennials the next year. Then after that, you're looking at burning about every 2 years as kind of the management of that property. So those plantings do change over time. The first year, like I said, it's mostly native annuals, and then you have short-lived perennials, and then you have long-lived perennials. So when you're designing seed mixes or when you're collecting seeds, however you're going to be managing those sites, you want to make sure that you have species that will come in and will survive longer than just the first couple years. So he thought about all that and thought, well, that sounds really interesting. You know, it'd be really good to plant at least a portion of the area in native prairie and get rid of these non-native grasses. But, you know, I spend a lot of time driving to Alexandria, and I see Kisatchie along the way, and I really like how it looks with those open forest conditions. And that's kind of the way it was in Kansas. Down in the lower areas, they had these open woodlands, and it just looked really nice. So, yeah, Chicken Man, you're exactly right. You know, that is exactly the way that most of our woods would have looked historically. We would have had open woodland conditions. There would have been fires that ran across the landscape, and that's what Kisatchie is mimicking. That's what they're mimicking in the woodlands out in Kansas. You would have had native species that can actually tolerate that fire and are adapted to that fire. You know, down central Louisiana, it's longleaf pine. Up here, it's shortleaf pine. And they're very well fire adapted, and historically we would have absolutely had the vast majority of our systems, our forest systems, as open woodlands or savannas. And so like I said, you know, down central Louisiana you had longleaf pine, but up here shortleaf pine. Those species actually they occur in the same geographic areas and at least a portion of their ranges, usually separated by soils or some other characteristic. So we get to talking about that and how important fire is in the ecosystem, and realize that if we look to create any sort of an open woodland habitat, you have to continue to maintain that and manage it with prescribed fire. Because we have examples of places just like this down in Florida, where you go a couple decades without fire and you can just watch it. You can watch the trees come in. So we're talking about all that, and he realized, okay, so I can plant prairie and I have to manage that. I can plant open woodlands and I have to manage that. All this ties back to prescribed fire because we don't want that situation. We don't want to just plant trees and it turn into essentially a wildlife desert. That's what we're trying to avoid. So thinking back to Kasachi and his particular objectives, he is really interested in turkeys and also quail. He did see some quail while he was in Kansas. So those two species are really interesting to him. And we're talking about, different forest management schemes. So if you typically, most North Louisiana landowners, most landowners period, plant trees and walk away. When you get that, you have a completely different wildlife response. So you have bobwhite using it maybe for the first few years and then they fade out. And turkey maybe use it for the last few years, but they don't always use that early successional stage. Without fire. With fire, you get a different response. You get species being able to use it across the entire range, things like bobwhite being able to use it from beginning to end. So planting species like shortleaf pine that you can burn after a few years gives you the opportunity to manage it for wildlife from young to old. So there's a few different situations that we do run into in North Louisiana. And we're telling him about all this, and he's thinking about it, still chewing on it, so just bear with us for a minute. But typical timber production scenarios. Don't pay too much attention to the numbers, they're not exact, but basically you're planting high density amount of trees, and you're walking away till it's time to cut it, come back in a few years, cut it again, clear cut it, and replant it. A good way to include wildlife in those scenarios is incorporating prescribed fire after that first thinning. So once you get a thinning, then burn it and burn it and burn it as much as you can until it's time to clear cut it again, replant it, and start the whole schedule all over. What that typically looks like are the dense forests that we see all over the state right now. Or you can restore a semi-natural woodland state over here, where you do have at least some native species coming back in there and being able to utilize those habitats once you get sunlight to the ground and manage that with fire. Another scenario that can be considered is what we'll call the wildlife restoration scenario. So this is trying to mimic the more natural processes and what would have happened historically, where you would have had open forest systems that would have had a disturbance, whether it's a tree-killing fire, a hurricane, tornadoes, aging out, whatever the case may be. But you start out with a forest stand, thin it down to low basal areas, and keep fire in there. If you skip a year or two, or even if you don't sometimes, you'll get natural regeneration of those forests. Whether it's shortleaf pine, loblolly, oak species, any of those upland species will naturally regenerate in those types of systems when you put sunlight on the ground. You keep fire in there. Once they get big enough to tolerate it, you keep burning it, you keep burning it. You harvest some of the overstory trees, make sure you have enough of your young trees growing up, keep burning it. Once it gets big enough, thin it out. You keep doing the same thing. You never have to replant trees. That may seem a little bit novel to us today because pine plantation systems have become so common, but that's essentially the way that people used to do forestry. They'd come in and manage what they had, they'd burn it, and then let it grow. It's just a different system. It's natural regeneration. So when you're taking stands that are existing forest lands and trying to return them to a more natural state, you're going to need a lot of prescribed fire. Most of the time when you start thinning out those forest stands, you're going to get a big flush of sweet gum, maybe of non-native species like tallow, privet, whatever other species there is. You're going to need a lot of fire to keep that stuff at bay for a little while until the system stabilizes itself. So a lot of fire those first few years. Generally speaking, if we can get 3 fires in the first 3 years, 5 in the first 10. And starting out in most of those pine stands in particular, or just upland forest stands, you want to start out with kind of easy fires. You don't want to go in there and just roast them. So January, February, that time frame being kind of the key. Trying to get what we'll call cooler fires. And then after you get 1 or 2 of those in there, then you can open up your burn window. Burn window and the burning season is really important because you do get a different response whenever you burn. These are all generalizations, but generally speaking, in the dormant season, that's kind of a maintenance burn, a management burn. You may be top killing some things, but usually you're not doing a whole lot of changing to the actual woody plants themselves, the roots. You're not killing the roots a lot of times. Whereas growing season burns are usually more effective at killing the roots, and depending on when you burn, you're going to change the ground floor response. Generally speaking, spring burns, you're going to favor summer grasses. If you do summer or fall burns, you're going to favor forbs and wildflowers for the next year. So a good way to think about that is whatever is actively growing and putting its energy up at the time that you're burning, that's what you're going to knock back. And whatever's going to be growing in the next season, the coming up few months, that's what you're going to be favoring. So a lot of our native grasses, a lot of their energy is coming up in July, August, September. If you burn them during that time period, you're going to set them back and favor the forbs, a lot of the winter forbs that may come in with basal rosettes over the winter. So we've talked about a lot. We gave Chicken Man a whole lot to think about. So he's just thinking about how does that all apply to my property? I've got hills, I've got a drain that runs through it. What do I do with all that information? I don't know. I don't know what to do. Tell me something. So we go back to those ecological site descriptions. What does that actually mean for that property? The red that was going through that drain in the bottom, that ties to this creek bottomland habitat. And what that means is historically that would have been a white oak, water oak system, depending on exactly where you are in that landscape, how wet it is, how close you are to the creek. Whereas the hills was what's called a loamy over clay upland. That was a shortleaf pine dominated habitat. So now we have a possibility of how we're going to tie in the landscape with what he saw out in Kansas and what he sees in Kisatchie. How are we actually going to mesh this all together? One of the cool things about those ecological site descriptions is that they actually give you a model of how to get from one state to another and what to do with all that information. So if you are starting down here at a planted pasture row crop system and you're trying to restore it, so look at that R5A, tree planting, mid-story, shrub control, prescribed burns. That doesn't include seeding of the native understory, but that is one method to restore it to get back to the top here, which is your shortleaf pine post oak forest, that being the ideal historical condition of that property. Something that he can manage to increase native populations of turkey, of quail, of all the other wildlife species that he's interested in. So now that we've talked about all the options, we look at what are we actually going to do to put that on the landscape. So this is Chicken Man's property. Those are not his chicken houses. That's not why he's called Chicken Man. But so talking about all the different options, again, you have the hills up here, you have a hill here, and hills on the south side here. And what we finally decided to do was try to replicate the natural forest conditions that would have occurred on the property, using what tools we had to our disposal by planting a native tree mix down in this bottomland that would be, so white oak in the drains right here and up here, and mostly a water oak cherry bark planting down through the actual bottom closer to the creek. But up on the hills, he really wanted to manage for that open woodland system. So getting shortleaf pine planted in there with other upland hardwoods, southern red oak, white oak, other species that are actually adapted to those upland areas. And then on this hill over here, he was actually going to build a barn and put just a native prairie planting right there. So trying to match the soils, trying to match the local habitat type with all the different options that are out there. Because for example, if we tried to put shortleaf pine down here in this drain, it probably would get a little more taken over with sweet gum and other species that are just more aggressive in those types of habitats.
How big is that piece?
That was 120 acres-ish. So now we know what we want to do. That costs a lot of money. Good news is there's a whole lot of programs out there for people that are interested in creating these types of habitat and trying to manage their property. So I work for Quail Forever. We're in partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is part of the USDA. There are offices in almost every parish, but if there's not one in your parish, there's one in the next parish over. So they have several different programs that are run through the Farm Bill that actually provide funding for people to manage their agricultural property. If you have any sort of an agricultural commodity that you are raising or producing, those programs are probably able to apply to you. Excuse me. 3 different programs that we work with really frequently and that may be of interest to each of you. The Environmental Quality Incentive Program, EQIP for short. You can do things like forest stand improvement, you can do tree planting, prescribed burning. It's kind of the entry-level program for just jumping in and getting something on the ground. Then there's the Conservation Stewardship Program. So that's usually for somebody that's already been managing their property. Maybe you have already been burning your property, but now you want to do something that is more of an enhancement. Instead of burning the entire property all at once, you want to burn it in sequential patches. So you burn a patch each year. That's a good program for those types of properties. CRP is another program that most people are more familiar with, and that is taking what was formerly cropland and returning it to some sort of a natural cover. Good example is planting that in prairie species, and you can see that's actually some cropland over there that's been planted back to prairie species. One of the newest practices in that program are what they call prairie strips. And not necessarily applicable across all of Louisiana, but in areas where there's any topography, you can break those strips up going up the hill, and that way it's reducing your erosion, it's reducing your nitrogen runoff, all the other inputs that are put onto farms, that helps to break it up so that it's not just running off in the water systems. There are some other programs that are out there and available. The USDA is not the only source of funding for private landowners. So LDAF has a program called the Forest Productivity Program. If you're interested in replanting shortleaf or longleaf on a property or doing prescribed burning, that's a great program for that. Partners for Fish and Wildlife has their own program that they cover a lot of different practices, everything from tree planting to I think I've even seen them doing some fencing out of streams and other areas like that. There's a newer program which I'm not as familiar with called CGRIP down in South Louisiana, Coastal Grasslands Restoration Incentive Program, I believe. I think there may have even been an email that went out at one point about that. So for anybody in South Louisiana, that'd be a really neat program. So all that to say, there's a lot of different options for people just like Chicken Man who just want to make their property a little bit better. If you want to manage it for wildlife, you want to incorporate wildlife in your management plan of whatever other agricultural commodity. There is unfortunately only one of me in the state, and there's a whole lot of people that would like to do this stuff. So the good thing is that we have private lands biologists with Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries all across the state. We also have the Natural Resource Conservation Service offices. For anybody that's interested in doing this type of work, you can find your local office. You can just Google them, it'll get you right to them. And if you have any questions, there's my contact information. Y'all can always call me and we'll try to get you in touch with the right person. So there's a lot of different options. If anybody's interested, there's a lot of private lands opportunity out there, and there's a lot of funding available for these types of projects. So if anybody has any questions, I think we have a few minutes. Absolutely. So he did actually just plant his shortleaf and his white oaks just last week, actually. So hopefully we'll give it a year and get some good pictures, and we'll send y'all some pictures of Chicken Man. Yes?
Prescribed
Mm-hmm.
Do professionals come out and do that?
They,
Part of the package deal of management?
So the way that those programs work is basically they provide funding for you to kind of coordinate the project. You would be the project manager. You can hire it out to different vendors. You can coordinate with any of those folks. Of course, lean on your private lands biologist, me, whoever you're working with to get in touch with some of those contractors. But there are certified vendors in the state that can come and do a prescribed burn on your property. It's always good to ask them if they're certified with the state, if they have their own insurance, all those questions. There is another approach that we've taken to that, and that's forming prescribed burn associations. We've actually formed 2 in the state now, one in north central Louisiana and one in kind of west central Louisiana. And what that is, essentially, it's a group of landowners just like y'all that says, look, we've got property that we need to burn, you have property that you need to burn, let's help each other. We'll pool resources together and try to get more manpower, more training to actually get fire on the ground as safely as possible. So, you know, just at its core, it's neighbors helping neighbors trying to get fire on the ground. But it's a good opportunity for folks that are interested and have property available to burn or just want to help other people burn. Did that fully answer the question?
Yeah, my anxiety would be, housing that might flank their professional.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, definitely get a contractor. Absolutely.
Kind of a follow-up, I was gonna ask you, is it a big challenge to be able to burn on a lot of these properties? As more and more people move into the country and they're living, they near some of these properties.
Yeah, so
Pushback you get, I guess.
the question was, how much trouble is it to burn some of these properties? And that does depend on the property and where exactly it's at. Usually the toughest ones to burn are ones that are just west of a major highway because you have winds that are usually pushing smoke right across that highway. So you got to kind of watch that. And that's something that you take into account with your burn plan, whether it's a group of landowners doing it or professionals that are doing it. There always needs to be that prescribed burn plan that takes into account all those factors. Really, the biggest issue that we have is just getting it done. We usually have enough burn window days to get out there and burn. It's just a matter of getting people together, pooling time and resources, and getting it done. Yes.
I totally understand that, you're with the Quail organization and that, that's kind of your perspective, I think.
Sure.
To a large degree. You seem to imply that maybe a closed canopy, mature forest space is in some sense, I think, I may misquote you now, I'm sorry if I do, but you seem to imply it was like a wildlife desert or something, do you see something, quail aside, inherently unhealthy about a closed canopy, mature forest?
So that's totally depending on where we're at, what the objectives are for the property, and taking into account the historical condition of that area. If you're talking about a bottomland hardwood stand or something that was naturally a closed canopy old growth, and that's exactly what that system should be, and we should not be managing for things like quail or other open condition species on that property. That needs to be based on that particular property. If we are talking about the effects of wildlife in upland hills that would have naturally been savanna or woodland, then unfortunately it just does have consequences on some of those species. That's not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with managing the property in one way or another, but it does have consequences on wildlife species depending on however we manage it. There's always winners and losers, no matter what situation we put out there. If it's an open canopy system, then there's species of birds in particular that won't use that. They'll only use the closed canopy. The difference being, I guess, in what the property would have historically been, what that property can support, and then what the objectives are for the property. Also knowing that a lot of the species that are in decline are using those more open systems that have a rich understory and a rich understory. rich overstory and understory. So going for diversity at all levels, it can be really important. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
It does. Thank you.
Yes.
Can you go back just 2 slides to the USDA programs?
No.
Sorry.
Oh, no. Because we recorded. Oh, okay, go back, got it. Thanks.
Yes.
This might be more of a quail question than a plant question. Do you consider quail going extinct in Louisiana because of all of the habitat loss that you've seen?
Hopefully in the near future, no. I can say that to date, I can't say that this is true for North Louisiana, but I can say in South Arkansas, I was up there for 2.5 years before I moved down here. Every property that had at least 80 acres that did good quail management, good upland wildlife habitat management, got that rich understory that we're talking about, had that a good matrix of native grass, native wildflowers, and shrubs. If they got that, they had quail within 3 years. And I hope that trend continues down here. I don't know that that's true yet, hadn't been here long enough to say that. But we worked with landowners that hadn't seen quail on their properties in 40 years. And to have them show up within 3 years, it's really awesome. And it's a testament to what impacts your wildlife management can have, whatever changes you make to the landscape. So I'm hopeful and probably a little bit optimistic that they won't go extinct in the near future. But numbers they're low. It is a very low density population. And the only places that I can consistently find them right now in the landscapes that we have is usually in areas that are new tree plantings in the first 2 to 7 years, because you have a mixture of native grasses, native wildflowers, and at least a pseudo shrubby component, usually those trees, whatever we planted. Yes?
2 comments and a question. The comment about the desert, I think you were referring to the picture that had pine, it was a plantation. It was timber production. Okay, never mind. The second comment is, there's people in this room that are burn certified. If they're willing to reveal themselves, and not necessarily. So we got some certified burn people, you can call them up and you can hire them, and they know what they're doing. And the third question, so Quail Forever, I've just heard lately about the seed mixes. Where do y'all get that?
So we don't actually get those seed mixes anywhere in particular. What we do is we create the seed mixes, and then landowners can order from any company that they want to.
Oh, what do you mean? You create the mixes?
Right, so there's a whole process that goes into actually developing seed mixes, as opposed to just going out and collecting them in whatever proportions are naturally available. There's a lot of seed companies that have spent a lot of time testing and going into, okay, so this species is aggressive. What percent of the mix can you tolerate until that species completely dominates everything else? And there's a lot of play and a lot of studying to be done on that, because that's going to operate differently depending on your soils and your local conditions and the seeds that year. Those seeds are going to be influenced by rainfall, by wherever they were grown. So I guess there's a lot of that goes into it, but I will say that we don't have any North Louisiana local, truly eco-type seed sources that I know of, except for 4 or 5 species. So that is certainly one of the big challenges that we have, and would love to see the opportunity for more true local native eco-type seeds like what we do see for South Louisiana. Yes?
I have a question about the quail. Once you have the land managed, and do you just wait for them to show up, or do you actually physically reintroduce quail to that area?
Good question. So we have not actually reintroduced quail because of the situation that I just described. We haven't seen an area yet. I've not personally worked on an area yet that there weren't quail somewhere in that landscape. Usually the issue was connectivity and having good sustained habitat. Now there are places in the country that that quail are considered completely extirpated. They have done some translocations and have had some successes there. Working through a lot of the details on that. Excuse me. But we have not done any of those here, and I have not seen anywhere yet in Louisiana that I thought needed that. Not to say that it's impossible. There may be places out there that need it, but I just hadn't seen any yet. So we have not been talking about that.
Hogs and coyotes.
Yep, just like all the other predators, they all impact them. Absolutely do. But anywhere that we get into an area that has that good matrix of cover, what you're trying to do essentially, we can't outmanage the predators effectively. It's not like it was 50 years ago when everybody was, trapping them, hunting them, and landscape characteristics were very different. The situation we have now, it's virtually impossible to trap out everything that eats a quail, because once you get one thing out, then something else will eat it, or somebody else will come in and eat them. So our approach is by trying to manage the cover so that they can, yes, absolutely, naturally escape. John Michael. I do.
Tell me this, tell me your success stories getting coal to the ground and finding remnants that you didn't have to herbicide and reset to zero. How often does that happen? Like what percent? How would you just save them because it looks good enough from the get-go and you just put fire on the ground so it doesn't move?
Unfortunately, I'd say that's a rare circumstance. We did find a clay morse prairie in southeast Arkansas that we did not know, to my knowledge, I don't know that we had any documented clay prairies.
What county?
Drew County.
Yeah, that's pretty odd.
Yeah.
That's pretty far.
Yes, it was.
And I know you tried and found it.
Yep.
And I'm glad for y'all's burn, your burn groups, and I hope they're working out good for you. But
Yep.
I just always hope that you guys will recognize it on the ground because Ben Clay's ecosite descriptions are a little bit bare bone. Once you get on the ground, you may find that they're very, very different in the local area. So
Oh yeah, absolutely.
we're just trusting you guys as professionals to see that stuff and save it. But obviously, well, they're coming back. They've been gone for a long time. So
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And I will say too, I mean, most of the time that if we're doing any sort of forest management, it's almost always just managing what's there. That's the best way to manage that type of habitat, and we have good results with it. Typically, as far as the plantings and coming in doing more disturbance, that's usually in areas that we know is non-native and has a history of being non-native for several decades. With the underlying assumption that typically, at least in this part of the South, typically areas like that don't have as good of a seed bank of the conservative perennial species. Yes.
I know if you've had a cold enough winter and the woodcock have migrated down, they love burn off areas too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You have resources for these seed companies?
We do. Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. If anybody's interested in doing this type of management, again, it's always good to think through the whole process first, from site prep to planting. Want to make sure that you also have the ability to manage that habitat. But yes, we absolutely do have resources. Feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about that. All righty. Well, thanks everybody.